Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Tibor Szilágyi. I'm coordinator for reporting and knowledge management in the Secretariat of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Before we start the official program, I would like to make some announcements. The webinar has interpretation in the 6 UN languages. Please select your language of preference at the bottom of the screen. When you are not listening to a particular language, please listen to the floor for best sound quality. Participants are kindly invited to use the chat function to seek support should they encounter any technical problems. But participants are kindly requested to submit questions to the panelists, to the speakers, through the Q&A function, also on the bottom of your screen. You have it on the bottom of your screen, paused from the left in my screen. So please insert your questions to the panelists during the presentation as soon as a question is coming up or would like to have some additional information or response to your question. So please insert it in the Q&A function, as we will take 1, 2, 3 questions after each presentation. Please note that if there are many questions, we might not have enough time to respond to all of them during the session. I therefore invite the speakers to check the Q&A function after their presentations and respond to any remaining questions there in the Q&A functionality. So these were the housekeeping announcements from my side, and now let's start with the program of the meeting. And I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the Convention Secretariat, the Secretariat of the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, to this webinar on showcasing SDG Target 3.a in Parties' Voluntary National Reviews. Since the adoption of the SDG framework by the UN General Assembly in July 2017, strengthening the implementation of the WHO FCTC is embedded in the SDGs under Goal 3. Goal 3, as you know, is ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. And Target 3.a is an implementation means. Target 3.a calls to strengthen the implementation of the World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control in all countries as appropriate. And the corresponding indicator is 3.a.1, age standardized prevalence of current tobacco use among persons aged 15 years and older. In 2021, last year, the Secretariat published a guide for WHO FCTC parties on how to include reference in the implementation of SDG Target 3.a in their voluntary national reviews. This is how the publication looks like, and you can find it on the website of the Convention Secretariat. And this VNR guide is available in all 6 UN languages. In July 2021, after the guide was published, we organized the first webinar on the topic, which is available for viewing on our website. This webinar we are attending today will capitalize on that groundwork and will provide an update on the most recent developments on the matter. Today, we will have 5 presentations from speakers from different organizations with different backgrounds, who will highlight the VNR process from different angles. I hope this will be an excellent learning opportunity for us all, and at the end of the webinar, we will be more informed on how we could all do more to reflect on the progress we are making in tobacco control at the UN's subsequent high-level political fora through the voluntary national reviews. After the webinar, we shall read again the guide, and we shall look at its recommendations through the lens of the new level of knowledge that we acquired today. To that, I would like to wish you all good deliberations, and without further ado, I would like to introduce the first speaker. And our first speaker is Heather Page, a statistician with the Sustainable Development Goals Monitoring Section of the United Nations Statistics Division, UNDESA. Heather will provide an overview of the VNR process. Heather, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Let me just quickly share my screen. Okay, great. Thank you so much. My name is Heather. I'm with the DESA SDG monitoring section, and we work closely also with the Office of Intergovernmental Support and Coordination for Sustainable Development, which is the office that really puts on the assistance to countries for the HLPF for VNRs. So just to get started, a little background on the VNRs. They have really actually been a success story of the 2030 agenda. And to date, 291 VNRs have been conducted from 187 countries. And you can see the progression as the years go on for the VNRs, where we have many presenting a second, third, and potentially even a fourth time. And so for this year's cohort, this is the geographic breakdown of the 42 VNR presenters that will present in the 2023 HLPF. Most of them are actually second-time presenters, having mostly presented in the first cycle of the VNRs. And this year, we will also have a first regional VNR by the European Union. So just here, I just wanted to include a quick timeline on some of the main points and global preparatory workshops that will occur throughout the year before the HLPF. And as I mentioned, this office in DESA oversees a lot of these global preparatory workshops, but in addition, the regional commissions are responsible for regional forums and also some workshops. And then here also included the deadlines for the main messages and the report, and also the audio visuals for the presentation. And all of this obviously is in lead up to the high-level political forum, which has a central role in overseeing a network of follow-up and review processes at the global level, where of course the VNRs are also presented as part of that process. There will actually be 2 meetings this year at the HLPF, since the HLPF meets every year under the auspices of UN ECOSOC, but it also this year will meet under the auspices of the GA for the SDG Summit, which will be held in September. And just to note, the HLPF does only review a few goals under review during the proceedings, but obviously, of course, the VNR should cover all of the SDGs. And just very quickly, in terms of the presentation at the HLPF, here we have some timings which will be subject to confirmation by the president of ECOSOC. But since almost all of the VNR presenters this year will be second-time presenters, they are allocated about 25 minutes at the HLPF and in a panel format. And so it's really an opportunity for exchange among the countries. So as countries are beginning to start to shape their VNRs and start planning their processes and working from the lessons learned potentially from that first VNR, I just included some main benefits of conducting the VNR. And so really the VNRs have been instrumental in keeping the 2030 agenda on the top of the priority list for countries. The VNRs really provide essential information on the situation of the SDGs at the country level, as well as related trends. And they show the efforts of the countries on the implementation of the agenda. And so this also includes identifying gaps, areas where advice or support is also needed. But the VNRs, the essence of the VNR and the importance of them is really the undertaking at the national level. The in-depth analysis that will occur by countries on their SDG implementation, the consultation that will also be conducted, in addition, the partnerships that will be mobilized in the process of the VNR, and also strengthening SDG awareness around the country. And so also the VNR provides an opportunity to really showcase how countries intend to close the gaps in implementation, where actions will be taken in order to catch up on resuming SDG progress. And then also, with a focus on evidence-based VNRs, which is what we would also strongly promote, is this can also help governments use the VNR process to identify strengths and weaknesses of the statistical systems and their data ecosystem, and to identify areas where perhaps statistical capacity building may be needed. So also when beginning work on the VNR, just some general principles to keep in mind. Obviously, they are voluntary, but this is a universal agenda, and so it applies to all countries, and all countries are encouraged to participate. And this is very much a state-led process, and the VNRs are really considered a platform for partnership. And this is also, as I mentioned, an opportunity for exchanging lessons learned and really focusing in and providing a spotlight on the national circumstances and how that national ownership of the 2030 agenda is advancing the SDGs. So there's a number of kind of key elements to consider for the VNRs. And this is outlined also in the handbook, which I'll mention in just another slide. But obviously, it's very encouraged to start early for the planning, as early as possible. And then some questions that countries could ask is, are you using existing coordination structures, or are you developing new ones? Have you developed a work plan or a roadmap? This is for the VNR process, but also we would encourage it for the data. How will you approach the VNR in comparison to how it was done in the past? How do you plan to gather the information and data in a limited time? What reports are you drawing upon? Kind of how are you building this first VNR if it's your first, but if it's your second or third, how is the country addressing the recommendations and the next steps that were outlined in that first VNR? And how is the country deepening implementation since then? And so for our office in statistics, the data element is, of course, kind of our main focus to ensure that the VNRs are evidence-based and truly reflect the progress on implementation in the country. We have developed a roadmap guide to kind of lay out key considerations for data and VNRs, and I'll mention that in a couple of slides as well. So in terms of which stakeholders to include for the VNR process, this is really an opportunity to really deepen engagements, to really focus and ensure leaving no one behind. Like, what does that look like as far as stakeholder engagement? And then really using the VNR as an opportunity to deepen the understanding of that scope, the limits, the challenges, and best practices. And also for our office, of course, one of the primary stakeholders for the VNR process should be the National Statistics Office, which we also recommend to have a lead role in the VNR preparation and also on the VNR teams. This has the added benefit of kind of activating the data ecosystem in preparation for getting all of this material together for the VNR. And then we would recommend also that stakeholder involvement does not only look to just a whole of government approach, but really a whole of society approach, which can also be instrumental in identifying data stakeholders that may be outside of government. We've heard from many countries on how even joined up and very communicative agencies found many data gaps that they could start to fill as they broaden their stakeholder engagement. So the VNR is also an opportunity to show how the 2030 agenda can be a roadmap out of the pandemic and also other crises that countries are facing. And so new and emerging challenges is also a section that is recommended to be included. And so this would be something to consider integrating into the VNR. And here we have some examples of how countries have done this in the past. We also have some more recent examples where countries are also addressing not only the pandemic, but also other crises and conflicts which are impacting SDG implementation. And where these examples are included in the VNR, it's really important, obviously, also that they are backed up by data. So I just have a next couple slides on resources and support for the VNR process. As I mentioned, the office that we work closely with in UNDESA also works with the UN country teams, regional commissions, and also other organizations. They hold global workshops, also regional and sub-regional workshops, but also individual assistance if needed or required can also be provided. In addition, they've developed a handbook and some the voluntary guidelines that we've just recently mentioned, but I'll also mention here. And so kind of forward looking toward the structure of the VNR report, included in that handbook that I mentioned is also an updated guidelines on the structure of the VNR report with opening statement methodology, and then really looking at the different pieces of progress on goals and targets, new and emerging challenges, means of implementation, et cetera. And as the 2030 agenda has progressed, really want to address how countries are dealing with the systemic issues and the transformative changes that need to occur to really push the implementation of the 2030 agenda forward. And then obviously, if you want to keep the report a bit lean, you can include annexes. Many have included voluntary local reviews, statistical annexes, et cetera. And then I also just wanted to mention in this same handbook is a VNR preparation checklist. And this kind of has 5 stages for preparing the VNR and outlines some of the main actions to be taken by countries. And just on my last slide, I just wanted to note that UNSD has prepared a practical guide for evidence-based VNRs using a roadmap approach and good practice examples to suggest kind of key stages in the national VNR process to enhance the use of data for evidence-based VNRs. And so I'd obviously also encourage you to look at that in case it can be helpful. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Heather, for this comprehensive presentation on what the VNRs are, what is the process of preparation of VNRs, what resources are available for the preparation of VNRs. I think that the experience of the past years in preparing and accepting the VNRs have helped a lot in developing a better understanding on how this process should look like. There's a question in the questions and answers header, so I would like to read that out for you. It's a question from Australia. If a country doesn't appear in that list of submissions at the start, does it mean that they have not yet submitted their reviews? Would there have been follow-ups made to the listed stakeholders for the country already? Trying to work out if we can support a push for our country, for Australia. So, Heather.
So my understanding is that the list of countries for each year, there's a certain amount of time that the ECOSOC president will allow for countries to submit their interest to present a VNR, and then they'll close that list. And so the list was closed, I think it's at 42 countries for this year. If so that list is only for this year's cohort. If the country has presented in the past, those VNRs are also available on the main VNR website. So if they don't appear in the cohort list for this year, I do not think that they'll be included at a later date.
So this year means that they are preparing their report now, but that will be presented in 2023.
Yes, sorry. Yes, I meant the 2023 cohort. So there was an opportunity for countries to nominate themselves for presenting, and that closed. And so therefore the 2023 cohort, the 42 countries, or 43, sorry.
Thank you very much, Heather. I would like to have a question myself about the process. In your experience and in your practical experience, how early a country should start preparing their VNRs? How long it takes at country level? 1 year, 2 years, or what is your experience?
It really varies. We have seen countries spend 8 to 10 months just on the data preparation piece, and then they would, engage in the VNR, like the broader VNR process, where you have more stakeholder engagement and things like that. We've also seen countries start from essentially zero, not having an online platform, not having a data gap analysis, not having looked at really the data availability of their framework, and put that together within 3 months to then use that for their VNR process. So I think it depends a lot on the ongoing SDG monitoring that is taking place in countries on a regular basis, because if you have kind of that platform, in particular, kind of an online platform that's very joined up within government and also outside stakeholders where applicable, you really have a system that can feed into the VNR. Whereas if you don't have that, you end up having to try to find the data and the information as you're going. But it really, really does very much depend on kind of the coordination structures, the data ecosystem structure, and also kind of how the country is addressing the VNR. But we highly recommend to give as much time as possible.
Thank you very much, Heather. And I would like to just reiterate what you said about creating partnerships around the VNR process. This is really important, and I think it's as important as coordination as the appropriate coordination of the process, because the two are linked to each other. So not having any other question to you, I thank you very much, Heather, for your presentation and being with us. And I would like now to turn to the second presentation. Our next speaker is Sarah Hitchman, my colleague in the Reporting and Knowledge Management team in the Convention Secretariat. Sarah is a technical officer in our team, and will be speaking about a new desk research which we have conducted in advance of this webinar, focusing on the inclusion of Target 3.a and Indicator 3A1 in the 2021 and 2022 VNRs. Sarah, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Tibor, for the kind introduction, and hello, welcome. And as Tibor has introduced, today I'll be discussing reporting on Target 3.a and Indicator 3.1 in the 2021 and 2022 VNRs. So first, a tiny little bit of background on why we decided to conduct this review. A previous review in 2019 reviewed 158 VNRs and for inclusion of 3.a, and they found that 36% of those VNRs made any reference to 3.a. This review then fed into a guide that was written, that was previously mentioned, on how to include 3.a in VNRs. However, we haven't really looked at progress in including Target 3.a since the guide was published. So progress since the publication is unknown. And so what we were thinking is we wanted to review the current inclusion of 3.a in the VNRs since the publication to try to get some insights into the effectiveness of the guide. So in order to prepare for this webinar and to gain some insights into the guide, we reviewed the VNRs available. We were only able to review the VNRs where the full report was available online. So for some countries, the report wasn't available on the online database. We reviewed the reports available up to about mid-November, so the ones that are available now. And if there was an annex, so some countries publish a statistical annex separately from their report, we also reviewed that. The majority of countries who submitted reports were parties to the WHO FCTC. And we noted that there was about 8 non-parties who submitted during the 2-year period. So for a little bit of the method on the current review and how did we approach it? First, we reviewed the reports for whether they included SDG 3. And this was because reports vary in their inclusion of the goals. So some reports may not include SDG 3. Next, we looked at whether they listed Target3.a, and that's strengthening and implementing the WHO FCTC. And after that, we looked at whether they reported on this. So not just whether they listed it, but whether there was some sort of reporting on it. Then we looked at whether they included 3.8.1, and that's the tobacco use prevalence, and then whether they included data on it or not. And then we looked for any kind of general discussions of tobacco control. The reports and annexes were searched for keywords and scanned. And then for each of those items above, we indicated a simple yes or no for inclusion. And because there was some subjectivity or judgment in judging inclusion, we tried to be liberal and indicating yes, it was included. And so what did we find in this review? So I'm going to be discussing the graph that you see here on the screen. The red bar is the 2021 and the orange is the 2022. And then the items along the bottom are what we were searching for. And I'm not going to make too many comments about the differences between the years because this could be influenced by the mix of countries that submitted in any given year. So first, what we found was that there was near universal inclusion of SDG 3 with 95% of countries discussing the goal in their reports. But then when we looked to 3.a, and so just the listing of the target 3.a, we found that it was less than half of countries were listing this target. When we looked into whether there was some actual reporting on that target, so for example, a country could just list the target and may not report on it. Again, it was about half of countries are reporting and a little bit less than those that were listing. But again, it varied because some countries might not list the target, but would still discuss some of their tobacco control achievements. Next, we moved on to looking at whether indicator 3.81 was listed. And again, it was about less than half, but still maybe a few more than 3.a. And then we looked at 3.8.1, so whether there was actually any data on 3.8.1. And here we found that there was a much higher percentage compared to some of the other items. So kind of the most popular thing for countries to do in their VNRs was to list prevalence of tobacco use and kind of compare them across. And one other kind of important thing to know is we just looked at yes or no inclusion of these, but one thing that we did find when we went across and we were kind of scanning through and reading through the reports was there was quite a difference in the depth of inclusion. So some countries might write a sentence or two about tobacco control and some may write a page about tobacco control. And it was similar with 3.8.1. So some might give tobacco use prevalence within a given year, and some might chart out the trend data over the last 5 years. So there was a variation in what we found. Next, we looked at kind of like other ways that tobacco use was discussed in the report. So it wasn't just discussed in the context of 3A and 3.8.1. It was also discussed in the context of Target 3.4 and Target 3.5. And Target 3.4 focuses on non-communicable diseases, while Target 3.5 focuses on substance use, drug use, and harmful use of alcohol. So we did also find some discussions of tobacco use under these targets, or at least discussed in the context of these targets. And just to kind of give you some examples to get an idea of what the reports looked like, if you haven't had a chance to read through them. Looking at Target 3.a, you'll see, for example, that Andorra talked about its recent ratification of the convention and how it was kind of starting to make changes in their tobacco control legislation. Niger talked about their tobacco use prevalence. If we look at kind of the type of reporting under 3.4, you see that Jordan discussed tobacco use in context of a risk factor for NCDs. And then looking onto Sweden, you see that they discussed tobacco use in the context also of alcohol and doping and drugs. So you kind of have a wide variation in the way tobacco use was discussed. Kind of looking further outside the field of SDG 3, we also saw that tobacco use was discussed in the context of raising revenues through taxation, but also through things like tobacco production, tobacco exports, and tobacco subsidies. Were discussed, of course, outside the context of SDG 3. And then tobacco use was sometimes included where countries would discuss inflation and inflation rate calculations. So kind of before we conclude, we do need to note some limitations of this kind of desk research. The VNRs are voluntary. The mix of countries that submit each year can influence the findings. We searched the report for keywords, and although we changed our keywords based on the language we were searching in, they were searched and scanned, but they were not read word for word. And as we said in the beginning, there was some kind of subjectivity in judging the listing or reporting, and we erred on the side of being liberal and saying, yes, it was included versus not. So kind of to summarize, well, as I said before, the vast majority of VNRs are covering SDG 3, but overall less than half are listing or reporting on Target3.a and Indicator 3.A1. If we look back to the previous review, overall, it's kind of a similar, we're getting about less than half, anywhere from 35, 40, 50%, including some reference to 3A, 3.A1. If we look into specific reporting and how detailed the countries got, reporting on 3A was less frequent and less kind of in-depth than reporting on 3.8.1. Okay, sorry. I'll just start the last slide again. So overall, we found that less than half were listed or reported on Target 3.A or Indicator 3.8.1. And overall, the percent of VNRs with references 3A or 3.8.1 was similar to 2019. Reporting on 3.A was less frequent than reporting on 3.8.1, and the depth of reporting on 3.A varied. Some countries listed Target 3.A, but they really actually focused most of their reporting on the indicator rather than on reporting on WHO FCTC implementation. Also, as discussed, some countries discussed tobacco control outside the context of SDG 3, and some discussed it in the context of other SDG 3 targets. Overall, what we would probably conclude here is that reporting on Target 3.A is not common, and that there's some potential for increased experience sharing in the future VNRs. So that's everything to conclude. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And I guess I can take questions if there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for presenting this research. I think your summary, your last sentence is very valid. So there's still room for improvement in including Target 3.A and even Indicator 3.A1 in the Voluntary National Reviews. So I think our publication is has not yet been benefited fully by the countries. So this is why I think we should continue working with the WHO FCTC parties to ensure that more and more parties will eventually report on Target 3.A and the respective indicator. Thank you very much for this overview. And we are now moving ahead as, let me see, sorry, the questions. There was a question which referred to another presentation, so Alison kindly responded to that question. There's no question to your presentation, Sarah, so thank you very much for presenting this research to us today. Our next speaker will be Mr. Luis Galicia, Program Manager at the General Directorate for Health in the Ministry of Public Health in Uruguay. Luis will be speaking about the preparation of VNRs in Uruguay, process and lessons learned. Luis, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Tibor, y muchas gracias por la invitación para participar en este webinar. Es un honor para el Ministerio de Salud Pública estar el día de hoy con ustedes. Perdón por el problema técnico. Bien, ¿pueden ver la presentación correctamente? Y me disculpo,
yes, we can, Luis.
Me disculpo por si escuchan un ruido exterior, pero estoy muy cerca de la ventana y hay una calle muy transitada que pasa justo delante de mí. Bien, entonces Uruguay realizó reportes nacionales voluntarios.
Luis, sorry,
Sí,
there
perdón.
is an echo in around you, Luis, and the interpreters have difficulties in hearing you.
Perdón, ¿me escuchan mejor ahora? Bien, Uruguay realizó reportes nacionales voluntarios sobre los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible de 2017 a 2019 y en 2021. En cada informe en Uruguay se presentaron entre 5 a 7 objetivos y en el informe de 2021 se presentó información sobre 9 objetivos. El ODS 3, que obviamente es el referente a salud, se reportó en 2017 y en 2021. Respecto del proceso de preparación de los informes nacionales voluntarios, la coordinación de estos informes es realizada por la Oficina de Planeamiento y Presupuesto, que se encuentra en la órbita de Presidencia de la República. Y además dentro de esta oficina hay una figura de un coordinador general del informe que cuenta con el apoyo técnico del área de gestión y evaluación de esta oficina. Además de esta función, la oficina monitorea y coordina las políticas públicas relacionadas con los ODS y otras entidades del Estado tienen un rol predominante para la elaboración de los informes, en particular, como lo ven en la diapositiva, el Instituto Nacional de Estadística, que provee o estima los indicadores para los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible y además apoyan a la coordinación nacional para obtener los indicadores que provienen de otras instituciones. De la misma manera, la Agencia Uruguaya de Cooperación Internacional da seguimiento y sistematiza las actividades de cooperación internacional que están relacionadas con los ODS. Finalmente, el Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores coordina con las agencias de Naciones Unidas estas mismas actividades de cooperación internacional. Estos 4 organismos son los que participan principalmente en la elaboración de los informes nacionales voluntarios. Específicamente en lo que se refiere al ODS 3, que es relacionado con salud y bienestar, la responsabilidad de elaborar el informe de avances sobre este objetivo recae en el Ministerio de Salud Pública como ente rector de la salud a nivel nacional. Durante todo el proceso de elaboración del informe se contó con el apoyo de un punto focal designado específicamente para cada uno de los objetivos y brindaba asistencia, por ejemplo, en la coordinación interinstitucional en caso de que fuera necesaria y en los aspectos relacionados con obtener la información y temas editoriales del informe que posiblemente después les explique brevemente. Dado que este informe tiene también en el ODS 3 metas relacionadas con la pandemia por la COVID-19, el Ministerio de Salud Pública tuvo, digamos, un espacio más alto o más grande, un mayor número de palabras disponibles para elaborar su informe. Se dieron lineamientos específicos para reflejar la información relacionada con la pandemia y el impacto que pudo haber tenido en el cumplimiento, en los avances del ODS 3. Es importante mencionar también que al inicio de la elaboración del informe, el Instituto Nacional de Estadística, que es la oficina estadística y rector del Sistema Estadístico Nacional, envía a cada uno de los puntos focales en los ministerios, o sea, en este caso a mí, que yo fui el coordinador del ODS 3, una planilla de Excel en la que están desagregados todos los indicadores que se van a reportar. Es una potestad también del Ministerio de Salud Pública incluir o agregar indicadores en caso de que así lo considere necesario. También es importante mencionar que mucha de la información que se genera para reportar el ODS 3 es proporcionada por el Ministerio de Salud Pública. Por ejemplo, las estadísticas de nacimientos, de mortalidad, prevalencia de VIH-Sida, toda la información o los datos se generan desde el Ministerio de Salud Pública y posteriormente son procesados y devueltos por el Instituto Nacional de Estadística para la elaboración del informe. En el caso específico de los datos sobre prevalencia de consumo de tabaco, los datos en adultos fueron obtenidos de la encuesta mundial de tabaquismo en adultos y los datos de adolescentes fueron obtenidos de las encuestas realizadas por el Observatorio Uruguayo de Drogas, que realiza encuestas cada 2 a 4 años, tanto en adultos como en estudiantes de enseñanza media. Con respecto a los plazos para la elaboración del informe, y acá seguramente no seguimos las buenas prácticas de elaborarlo con un periodo, digamos, más prolongado de tiempo, verán que tuvimos aproximadamente un mes entre el inicio de la elaboración del informe y la entrega a la coordinación nacional. Durante el 5 a 9 de abril se hace una coordinación con la institución líder del ODS 3. En el periodo más o menos de 3 semanas se hace una revisión técnica de los informes de avances sobre el ODS 3. Y acá quiero resaltar que, dado que se informó sobre este ODS en el 2017, en el 2021 lo que se reporta o lo que se informa son las modificaciones en los avances. No se hizo una elaboración desde cero, sino que se realizaron actualizaciones a los avances, por ejemplo, en el marco normativo y demás que les voy a mencionar brevemente a continuación. Luego se contó con un periodo de validación y aprobación por parte de las autoridades del Ministerio de Salud Pública, esto es el Director General de la Salud y el Ministro de la Información que fue volcada en el informe, y finalmente el 10 de mayo se entrega a la Coordinación Nacional en la Oficina de Planeamiento y Presupuesto. Posterior a ese periodo hubo cierta revisión, pero más que todo con respecto a los arreglos editoriales. Cabe destacar también que la información que el Ministerio de Salud Pública reporta no es modificada en la Coordinación Nacional, sino se toma como el informe final con la información que se provee desde el Ministerio de Salud Pública. Con respecto a las principales directrices que se nos dieron para la elaboración de este informe, en primer lugar que tenga un enfoque de derechos humanos, ya que particularmente el ODS 3 de salud tiene en Uruguay el enfoque de derechos humanos desde la legislación y desde la política sanitaria, que se reportaran avances en los objetivos sanitarios nacionales. Uruguay elaboró en 2015 una serie de objetivos basándose en la identificación de problemas prioritarios. Esos objetivos se desarrollaron entre 2015 y 2020 y a partir del 2021, con los retrasos propios de la pandemia, se desarrolló un nuevo proceso de elaboración de objetivos sanitarios nacionales, que básicamente continúan con el trabajo realizado a partir de 2015. Estos objetivos están prontos a ser publicados y amplían el plazo de actuación hasta 2030, en parte para dar más plazo a la autoridad sanitaria y además para alinearlos con los ODS. Se nos informó que tendríamos que reportar cambios en las políticas regulatorias y legislativas, también hacer un énfasis en las acciones para mantener o avanzar en las políticas a pesar de la pandemia por la COVID-19 y también sobre adaptaciones en las políticas durante la pandemia por la COVID-19. Por ejemplo, los avances realizados en la telemedicina o teleasistencia, que fueron uno de los principales motivos por los que Uruguay, tuvo un tránsito menos severo que en otros países con respecto de la pandemia. Y finalmente reportar las metas e indicadores de cada una de esas metas en cumplimiento con las directrices de Naciones Unidas. Con respecto a las áreas participantes desde el Ministerio de Salud Pública, las pueden ver ahí, puse al final y marcado en negritas el programa de control de tabaco, que con respecto al ODS 13, específicamente al objetivo 3.A y 3.A.1, es el que valida la información recibida del Instituto Nacional de Estadística y además elabora la justificación y los avances que se reportan en el Informe Nacional Voluntario. Con respecto a lo que se refleja del cumplimiento o los avances en el Convenio Marco para el Control del Tabaco en el Informe Nacional Voluntario, la información estadística sobre el control de tabaco fue proveída por el Instituto Nacional de Estadística y validada por el Programa de Control de Tabaco. Las gráficas, por ejemplo, y su interpretación también fueron provistas por el Programa Nacional de Control de Tabaco, y la información relacionada con el marco regulatorio, las intervenciones y también los retos fue provista por el Programa de Control de Tabaco. Como lo mencionaba previamente, esta información no sufrió modificaciones en la versión final del informe, sino más bien fue tomada tal cual por la Coordinación Nacional del Informe Nacional Voluntario. También es importante mencionar que además de la información sobre tabaquismo en adultos, el Programa Nacional de Tabaco y la coordinación del ODS 3 incluyó una información adicional sobre tabaquismo en adolescentes, ya que se consideró necesario reflejar también la tendencia a lo largo del tiempo en el consumo del tabaco por parte de las personas más jóvenes, que es donde se entiende también enfrentamos los restos más importantes. Finalmente, toda la información relacionada al marco regulatorio, además llevó una pequeña sección que realmente es un párrafo dentro de una sección final del informe del ODS 3, que refleja los grandes retos. Y creo que este es un tema relevante, porque más allá de Uruguay como un país que ha avanzado mucho en las políticas regulatorias para control de tabaco, reflejamos los retos, lo que nosotros desde las áreas técnicas entendemos como los principales retos a futuro y en lo que el país debería seguir avanzando para tener un abordaje más integral de la epidemia del tabaquismo, y esto obviamente fue validado por las autoridades y reflejado en el informe final. Entonces, estas son las grandes, a grandes rasgos, lo que sucedió durante la elaboración del Informe Nacional Voluntario y específicamente en el informe del ODS 3 y lo relacionado con el Convenio Marco para el Control del Tabaco. Pueden ahí ver al final un enlace al Informe Nacional Voluntario, obviamente solo está disponible en español, y les dejo mi dirección de correo electrónico si posterior a este webinar tienen alguna pregunta o alguna consulta relacionada con la elaboración del Informe Nacional Voluntario. Y nuevamente agradezco al Secretariado por la invitación a participar en este evento.
Thank you very much, Luis, for this presentation. I think it was very important to see how the VNR process is actually run at country level. And this has been not only a great experience, I think, which you described, but also we were also very satisfied with the content of Uruguay report in terms of tobacco control. And this is why we invited you to present this story on how these reports have been elaborated. We specifically looked at the 2021 report, which you mentioned that you elaborated two, which included goal 3. So it has been a very descriptive and detailed report. And I think it's a good example to be followed by other parties to the convention. I specifically liked the involvement of the different departments in the Ministry of Health. So it's not enough that only the leadership of the ministry, but the different departments who are the data owners and who can interpret those data were involved in the process. So I see no question related to your presentation. So I would like to thank you very much for your participation and your presentation. And we are now moving ahead to the next presentations. I would like to transmit to the speakers and request from the interpretation team that if you could use headsets so that you are better heard by the interpreters, and that would be very good. So thank you very much if you could do that. And now we would go to the next presentation, which will be delivered jointly by two colleagues from the World Health Organization. Alison Comer from No Tobacco, previously Tobacco Free Initiative in WHO headquarters, and Ada Moatsiri from Tobacco Free Initiative from the WHO Western Pacific region. So Alison and Ada will speak about instigating change through VNR reporting. Alison, Ada, you have the floor.
Thank you kindly, Tibor. Is my sound okay? Super.
I can hear you well.
Okay, thanks so much. So I work in the team in WHO headquarters that gathers all of the information for the WHO report on the global tobacco epidemic, and also our trends in tobacco use global reports. So I'm showing you a picture of what we have in our data set. And I can, the clear message is that probably from most of the SDGs, the tobacco use indicator would be the one with the really excellent coverage globally. So WHO and the Convention Secretariat together work to gather the surveys from the parties to the FCTC through their party reports. And we also gather from the WHO member states through our regional and country networks. So this map is looking back over the last 12 years. We can see 186 countries that have published at least one nationally representative survey of adults, which measures indicator 3.8.1. So once we have gathered the surveys, we extract the data and apply a statistical model so that we can make all the data comparable, because countries are running their own survey systems. Sometimes they use an international survey, but sometimes they have their own homegrown surveys. And there's a lot of variation in terms of the age groups covered, the tobacco types covered, and of course the years in which they run them, because not many countries run a survey every year. So once we have the data set in a comparable format, then we use the model to estimate trends. And so the trends period is from the year 2000 to 2025, which allows us to have some data point for most countries in every year, and also some idea of what's coming in the future. So we can project up to 2025, which is an important year for WHO initiatives such as the NCD Global Action Plan. We publish the results of our modeling after we have a country consultation, and we put the results in the WHO Global Report on Trends in Prevalence of Tobacco Use, and we share the same results with the UNSD for SDG reporting as the custodian agency. So I'm just going to talk about how 3.a is a facilitating target that benefits not only the health SDG, but also many other SDG goals. So the first one up there at 1 o'clock in the circle, poverty. So I'll give you some pointers on things that we've learned from the literature and things that we know very well in tobacco control circles, but which aren't probably widely known in the broader development aid and economic forums. So, for example, in low-income households with one or more tobacco users, studies have found that up to 10% of household expenses are dedicated to buying tobacco, which obviously leaves less to spend on food, healthcare, education, and leaves families more vulnerable to debt. Tobacco-related illnesses such as chronic respiratory disease, cancer, diabetes can lead to catastrophic health spending, then incapacity to work, and then sometimes the death of the main breadwinner. So moving to the second, the zero hunger goal. Spending the household budget on better food instead of tobacco would lead to health benefits for all, especially addressing malnutrition and child health and development. There's really no reason to grow tobacco when food security has not been achieved. And indeed, in 2023, the World No Tobacco Day theme will be tobacco and food, i.e. food rather than tobacco. Number 3, obviously the health goal, reducing tobacco use is going to impact in so many ways. So we all know well that 8 million tobacco-related deaths occur every year. But on top of that, there's around 240 million people suffering from a tobacco-related illness. This brings unnecessary pressure on health systems because of tobacco-related illnesses. Smoking is causing a large proportion of non-communicable diseases such as cancer, respiratory diseases, diabetes, and tobacco use leads to more severe COVID.
Excuse me, Alison, we are still seeing your first slide on the map.
Ah, I'm sorry. I'm on my second slide.
Okay.
But thank you for pointing that out. I only have 2 slides. Yeah, so other health impacts are less safe pregnancy, underweight babies, higher infant mortality. Then tobacco use is also sometimes a gateway to other serious drug use and addiction. Tobacco use makes UHC harder to achieve, with the global average of direct costs related to smoking estimated at 5.6% of healthcare spending globally in 2012. And out of that, just in the lower middle income countries, around 4% of healthcare spending could be attributed to tobacco-related illness. Tobacco use robs children of their right to good health by getting them hooked at a vulnerable age. Goal number 5, gender. While 37% of men in the world are currently using tobacco, only 8% of women are doing so. In some countries, use of poorly regulated tobacco products like smokeless tobacco can be more prevalent among women, leaving them exposed to more harm. Even in countries where tobacco use among women is close to 0, gender inequality makes it difficult for women to protect themselves from the risks of secondhand smoke exposure in the home and in the workplace, and also from adverse spending decisions in the household regarding purchasing tobacco. To expand their markets in developing countries, the tobacco industry targets women with messages of equality and power, while at the same time, they propagate images of masculinity to keep the men hooked on tobacco. Moving to target 8, decent work. Tobacco farms often employ children and extra workers at the harvest time, exposing all of them to green tobacco sickness and keeping the kids out of school. There's no guarantee of a minimum wage or decent working conditions on farms or cigarette factories located in countries with weak labor laws. On economic growth, a 2011 study estimated that the direct and indirect smoking-related costs across 16 low and middle-income countries accounted for anywhere between 0.1% of GDP, were up to 3.4% in the Philippines. A 2016 study estimated the total economic cost of smoking globally at $1.4 trillion US, which is equivalent to 1.8% of the world's annual GDP. The tobacco industry convinces governments that it's contributing to the economy by bringing jobs, but actually they are choosing locations that allow them to pay lower wages and avoid stringent rules on environment and safe workplaces. The tobacco industry is monopolistic, and farmers are often stuck with disadvantageous terms and conditions if they sign up to grow tobacco. Some countries are even paying subsidies to tobacco farmers to prevent economic losses from growing tobacco. The tobacco industry uses front groups to argue that smoke-free environment laws hurt business, but evidence from countries shows the opposite. Workforce productivity and absenteeism are impacted by the widespread burden of tobacco-related illnesses. So the cost of tobacco to the economy surely outweigh the benefits. Moving to goal 10 on inequalities. In general, tobacco use rates are higher in lower and middle income groups and lower educational level groups. Lower socioeconomic groups tend to be the last to break free from tobacco use. Lower socioeconomic groups are also more likely to be exposed to secondhand smoke. Addressing the reduced inequality SDG will also work the other way and help reduce demand for tobacco. Goal 12, responsible consumption and production. Tobacco is a consumer product that, when used as intended, kills up to half of its users. Cigarette butts are the most widely littered product globally, disposed of outdoors where they're either left to further pollute the environment, poison animals, or public money is spent trying to clean them up. There is zero benefit from tobacco in any arena, yet countries struggle to achieve Target3.a. This is the main thing preventing strengthening of the WHO FCT in countries. The global tobacco industry is intentionally blocking it. On climate action, tobacco farming causes up to 5% of global deforestation, and a 1999 study connected it to almost 20% of China's deforestation. On water, goal 14, 4.5 trillion butts are discarded every year, and they make up 15% of total debris collected worldwide during an international coastal cleanup that occurred in 2015. One single cigarette butt can pollute up to 500 milliliters of water. Butts contain heavy metals, lead, mercury, arsenic, tar, and nicotine, which is poisonous to animals, and us, by the way. Filters become plastic waste. Butts can take 10 years to degrade. Toxic particles released into the air while smoking end up in the water. Goal 15, land. 15 million hectares in 125 countries are under tobacco cultivation. Tobacco farming commonly uses large amounts of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and growth regulators, and wood is burned for flue curing. Tobacco crops strip the soil of nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium faster and to a greater extent than major food and cash crops. Forests and habitats are destroyed to grow tobacco, land which could be put to good use, redressing habitat loss and food insecurity. Supporting alternative livelihoods for former tobacco farmers is one of the articles of the WHO FCTC. Finally, goal 16, strong institutions. Countries have some as yet unrealized opportunities in the WHO FCTC to raise revenue for health and development by heavily taxing tobacco and related products, by collecting fines from violations of tobacco laws, by requiring tobacco vendors to be licensed, and by generally raising the cost of doing business on the industry. Governments tend to have less power than the industry when it comes to tobacco control, and often have smaller budgets as well. The industry fights every effort governments make to strengthen implementation of WHO FCTC, including threatening lengthy legal challenges, and they succeed again and again at weakening and delaying action in order to protect their profits. The FCTC calls on countries to not engage with the tobacco industry, even when the industry offers to be part of the solution, and to separate them from governance institutions. While many SDGs have no clearly defined policy route to reach the targets, we have the WHO FCTC, and 181 countries agreed to implement it. Under Article 21 of the Convention, parties agree to share information freely to strengthen the global effort against the global industry. And VNR reporting is one important avenue that can make the difference. So in summary, using 3.A and 3.A.1 indicator to advocate for other SDGs will be facilitated by always including it and reflecting on progress in the SDG reporting. And now I'll hand to my colleague Ada, who's going to present the last slide.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. So just to give a perspective from a regional and country office level, I just wanted to reflect on how in the Pacific Islands we included tobacco control in the Voluntary National Reviews. So from 2018 to 2020, and hopefully again very soon, several Pacific Islands were preparing their Voluntary National Reviews, and WHO had the honor of coordinating with the Global Alliance for Tobacco Control, formerly Framework Convention Alliance, to support our countries to draft summaries briefly describing the progress that they've made in tobacco control. So these were short narratives highlighting great achievements. And WHO worked closely with the Ministry of Health counterparts, where our Global Alliance for Tobacco Control colleagues worked with NGO members in countries. And so this was very helpful because it increased, I believe it increased our chances of being reflected in VNRs. So while some countries didn't include tobacco control progress summaries in their reports, they still did more often than not report on the indicator 3A1 because, as Allison mentioned, we do have regular reporting for the WHO global report on the global tobacco epidemic. And one of the opportunities that WHO was able to support our colleagues is oftentimes it's outside of ministries of health that are in charge of the VNRs, as our colleague Sarah had mentioned and Heather had mentioned, where their prime minister's offices or central national planning and sustainable development departments. And so it was a way of encouraging our colleagues and supporting our colleagues in health to engage with their counterparts in this particular way. While NGOs are often consulted, it was really helpful that our Global Alliance for Tobacco Control colleagues worked with their NGO counterparts. And it's very fitting that we'll hear from our Global Alliance for Tobacco Control colleagues next. And thank you for inviting us here today.
Thank you very much, Alison and Ada, for this presentation. I think it was very useful, and we hear you that, Alison, you presented the many interlinkages between this implementation means targets 3.A, but which helps not only other targets under goal 3, but it's interacting with so many other targets in among the SDGs. So it is important that when you act to control tobacco, in fact, you are having and you are instigating a positive impact in case of other targets and indicators as well. And Ada, it is very good to hear about the help you provided together in collaboration with the Global Alliance for Tobacco Control to some parties in the region. I think we need to expand, we need to use that experience and expand on that to help other FCTC parties in other regions to do the same. So we'll be in touch to ensure that this experience is being utilized in other parts of the world as well. So we have one question in the questions and answers, and I'll try to read it out. 3A facilitates all the 17 goals, isn't it? For example, 4, education has to do with smoking. 6, water pollution by fertilizer, cigarette butts, deforestation. 7, energy sources for drying up leaves and deforestation. 9, tobacco farming slows industrialization. 11, city environment and smoking. Fires, cigarette butts, secondhand smoking. Space occupied by smoking area. 17, relationship to block smuggling. I think these are all very important points. Would you like to add something, Alison? I think you mentioned most of them, but if there is anything left, please.
No, I think our colleague, thank you. I think our colleague has done a very good job of expanding the list. Yes, I just mentioned the ones which are quite obvious, but yes, I expect when countries start reflecting on tobacco within all the SDGs, they will come up with many of their own as well, which are like pertinent to their own country situation, which we haven't seen at a global level necessarily, but for sure, I'm not surprised. But thank you to the colleague for adding those to the list.
Thank you very much, Alison. And just to say that we as co-custodians for Target3.a, we work together every year to provide inputs to the SDG reports, and we will continue to do so. One other thing which I wanted to mention also in relation to interlinkages, that the Convention Secretariat was part of the working group that operated under the interagency expert group on SDGs. There was a working group that specifically focused on interlinkages, and the FCTC was presented as a good example on how an international treaty links together different other targets and goals among the SDGs. So it relates very much to what you presented in relation to interlinkages. That report is also available on the UN Statistical Division's website. So thank you very much, Alison, Ada, for this presentation. And we are now moving ahead to the last, but not least, presentation, which will come from Leslie Ray-Ferra, who's the Executive Director of the Global Alliance for Tobacco Control. I think many of you still know Global Alliance for Tobacco Control on its older name, Framework Convention Alliance for Tobacco Control, which was which is an international NGO that was instrumental in the process of developing the FCTC, and since then, as observer to the COP, they are an excellent partner of the Convention Secretariat and also WHO in promoting the implementation of the treaty. So Leslie will speak about including Target3.a in VNRs, but from a different perspective. Its importance from a communication point of view, and the benefits of including, and the role of the civil society in the process of reporting. Leslie, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Tibor, and thanks for allowing civil society to speak to this important topic as well. Just to give a heads up, my child is unfortunately home ill today, so if he wakes up, I will bring you with me and my computer while I go and get him, but we'll hope that doesn't happen. So as Tibor mentioned, I'll be speaking on including Target3.a in the VNRs, mostly the kind of, to use this as a communication tool, but also the importance and benefits of including the civil society in this process. So next slide, please. Great. So I've just got 4 larger topics to cover. We heard a little bit about the importance of Target3.a today, so I'll kind of briefly skim over that. talk a little bit about communicating the value of Target 3.a, the benefits of including civil society, and then more importantly, the role that civil society can play in promoting this inclusion and importance of Target 3.a. Next slide. Great. And next slide as well. Great. So obviously we heard, today that SDG 3 aims to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all ages. One of the means of achieving this goal in particular is to strengthen the implementation of the WHO FCTC in all countries as appropriate, which we consider or refer to as Target 3.a. The FCTC is being named as development priority is an opportunity to accelerate tobacco control and development efforts at the national level. Therefore, it's extremely important for parties to really work to include 3.a and its indicator 3.a.1 in their VNRs. And as we heard from Sarah earlier, we're only seeing about half of the countries actually reporting on 3.a when they're reporting on goal 3. It'd be fabulous if we could see all of the countries reporting on 3.a as a means to achieve goal 3. One other thing we haven't also talked about today.
Leslie, could you speak a little bit slower? The interpreters have a hard time to following you. Sorry.
Sure.
Thanks.
Sorry, that's one of my flaws. Yes. One of the other points as well is, we've talked about the FCTC being linked to the SDG agenda, but it is also a part of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on financing for development, which means, governments pledge their support to mobilize resources for FCTC implementation. It's also an agreement that governments should increase tobacco taxes in order to address the NCDs and tobacco epidemics, to mobilize additional resources for both the SDG agenda and also the FCTC implementation. And we have seen through the VNRs recently that some governments have actually already taken these steps and included that in the VNRs. And so we've seen, I think it was a couple of years ago, both Panama and Palau highlighted how they use tobacco tax revenue to fund the implementation of other targets. So not just 3.a, which I believe one of the speakers mentioned today that they've seen tobacco taxes being mentioned in the VNRs, not necessarily specifically under 3.a, but as a means to achieve other targets through that additional resource mobilization from taxation. Next slide, please. So why even include 3.a? Including 3.a will ensure that tobacco control remains a high priority as governments turn SDG commitments into action. So more importantly, this actual VNR process is an opportunity, especially for low and middle income countries, to secure additional funding for national tobacco control programs. So if tobacco control is prioritized at the national level, and we can see that if it's included in the VNRs and other national development plans, the idea is then more domestic funding will go into tobacco control programs, which in turn results in a more predictable and sustainable stream of funding for tobacco control programs. Also, if it's included in national development plans, individual countries can call on international donors to fund these plans and strategies. And then also having this included in these strategies, you could reach out then to the World Bank, the UN agencies, regional development banks, etc. So it's not just including it in the VNR, it's just when you include it in a VNR, it further strengthens the argument that it is a national development priority, which then in turn can bring in additional funding from international sources and also domestic sources. Next slide, please. Great. So communicating and positioning Target 3.a. At COP8, the COP adopted the global strategy to accelerate tobacco control, which is a 6-year plan that outlines the way to advance FCTC implementation via this Target 3.a. And there's a specific objective 2.1.2, which requests parties to ensure that the WHO FCTC is fully mainstreamed in the implementation of the 2030 agenda. So that already there is a huge communication piece that, the global strategy is also linked to the SDG agenda. And including 3.a can help raise awareness of the urgent need to implement the FCTC, while in turn also contributes to filling the objective of 2.1.2 of the global strategy. And we also have heard today, I believe Alison spoke a lot about it, about the linkages between tobacco control and other targets. But, tobacco control and economic development are complementary. So best practice in tobacco control leads to population health gains, can act as a source of revenue through tobacco taxes, and both of which can support governments in pursuing the SDG agenda and related targets. Referencing the FCTC and the VNR also provides an opportunity for countries to highlight the achievements in tobacco control. And there are a lot of countries that are making progress in terms of tobacco control. And it's just a really great way to be able to highlight that and to engage in knowledge translation and exchange, be able to talk about lessons learned from implementing these tax policies and everything. So these are all just ways to why it's beneficial to even communicate this and how to even position 3.a. So it's different ways that you can highlight progress or other aspects of 3.a in your VNR itself. Next slide, please. Some of the reporting best practices we heard from Sarah earlier. There's kind of three ways, in my view. You have your paragraph format, which is your standard text. And that text, as mentioned, doesn't have to be just under 3.a. It'd be fabulous to see reference to tobacco and the different kind of progress that it's made throughout the goals, as I said, as taxation. So using the text and paragraph format is a really good best practice, but also being sure to include the data in the annex is also another important aspect. And outlining the involvement of civil society and the multi-stakeholder approach to the VNR is a very good reporting practice. As Heather mentioned, partnerships is key to this. There's a whole component of building your VNR where there's the stakeholder engagement process. And I think highlighting that in how the government is taking a whole of government and whole of multi-stakeholder approach to the VNRs and to the SDG agenda is a very good practice. I've just highlighted a few resources as well here, one of them being the report by the UN Development Group on guidelines on how to prepare a VNR, and also the Secretariat's report that Tibor mentioned at the beginning, which is specifically on Target3.a. Next slide, please. Great, so now I'll dig into my forte, which is civil society. So a few benefits, in my opinion, of why we should include civil society in the VNR process. So it's not mandatory at all, but it is, civil society engagement is strongly encouraged to ensure that voices are heard from a civil society perspective and that the process is multi-stakeholder. And in the FCTC, civil society is, the specific article that mentions civil society involvement. And we've also seen through the SDG process the role that they play. So as I've said, it's not mandatory, but strongly encouraged for countries to allow civil society involvement. Civil society expertise is also underutilized, but can really provide insight that's sometimes lacking within government. And so we see that sometimes governments are overwhelmed or they're lacking capacity. And that's where civil society can come in and provide that additional insight and expertise. We can also offer technical expertise to ensure that tobacco control is adequately addressed in these reviews. A couple examples of that is that FCTC implementation is included in the SDGs. We know that it's a proven and cost-effective tool to reduce tobacco use. Tobacco taxes are essential for development, as the tax increases create sustainable revenue for governments to finance other development priorities if needed. And progress on Target3.a means progress in other areas of the goals, on NCDs, malnutrition, poverty, gender, etc. And so we often, as civil society, can come and have different expertise and areas of technical expertise that we can provide on these multiple different fronts, whether it be development, taxation, etc. Next slide, please. And lastly is the role of civil society. Civil society has a really big role to play to continue to advocate for and elevate tobacco control in the development agenda. We've been trying very hard to be loud and obnoxious and put those same arguments out that tobacco control is a development priority. And so we still have a lot of work to do. And I think the VNR process is an excellent opportunity for us to continue to advocate for that. And we can do this and achieve this through holding governments to account on progress and challenges. Governments signed up. We have 181 parties to the treaty, and they have signed up to implement the treaty. And we're not seeing as much progress as we would like to see. And that's a role we can play, is holding them account on progress. Continuing to do advocacy to promote tobacco taxes as a best buy solution and a way to accelerate progress on tobacco control and sustainable development. We have to continue to advocate and advocate for change in the inclusion of tobacco control and development discussions. Promote increased partnerships and a multi-stakeholder approach. That's something we heard a lot today, and that's something that I think that everyone needs to be open to that in terms of multi-stakeholder approach. It's multi-sector within the government, but it's also including UN and other international organizations and civil society as well, having a seat at the table. And also, as I mentioned on the last slide, serving as technical experts to ensure that tobacco control is addressed in VNRs. Last slide. So just a few key takeaways. Including 3.a in the VNRs is an excellent opportunity to demonstrate progress and also continue to make progress on tobacco control and our development efforts. Communicating the importance of Target 3.a is important, very important, and supports implementing the global strategy. And lastly, civil society has a great role to play in elevating tobacco control in the development space. And we will continue to do that. And I'm really glad that the WHO colleagues mentioned the work that we've been doing with parties and supporting them as well. And that's something that we will continue to do with the Secretariat and others to ensure that parties and countries feel adequately prepared to actually address 3.a in their VNRs. So thanks so much, Tibor. I finished just in time.
Thank you very much, Leslie, for this excellent summary. Of course, your summary on the role of civil society organizations and how the civil society could contribute at the national level to the preparation of VNRs, of course, is well taken. But your point in relation to inclusion of Target 3.a in the Voluntary National Reviews, helping with keeping tobacco control as a higher priority in the national agendas, is also very important, as it helps with the mobilization of resources, which is also very important matter in resource scarce, let's say, countries. So this is very important that including tobacco control, including Target 3.8 in the VNRs, can eventually lead to an increased mobilization of resources nationally and also internationally. So this is a very important takeaway message on top of what you already summarized. And since we only have 2 minutes to close this webinar, and we do not have questions in the questions and answers, I would like to say a few words at the end of this webinar, is that we heard from the speakers about the preparation of VNRs and the ways of including references to Target 3.a and Indicator 3A1. We heard about the role of the various stakeholders in achieving this goal. The national statistical offices that usually prepare country data for their inclusion in the reviews, the coordinating entities that take the lead in the coordination of inputs from the various stakeholders, including from civil society organizations. We have seen that in several reports, for being included in the reviews. The role of the ministries of health in providing information about progress in tobacco control, in achieving Target 3.a, and all those that could have an additional supportive role, but a very important role, and it was highlighted the role of WHO, civil society organization, and we tend to hope that the Convention Secretariat's contribution with the publications, with the webinars, with raising awareness, with interacting with different stakeholders, could also have a role in raising awareness about the importance of including Target 3.a in the reviews. I'm sure that with all that we heard today, we see the 2021 guide for the parties on including Target 3.a in the Voluntary National Reviews in a new light. What we heard will allow us to remember, to reflect on our successes and challenges in tobacco control in the VNRs, to let the fellow countries know about the progress we are making individually and globally in implementing the convention under Target 3.a, and to approach the preparation of the VNRs considering the good practices presented. As we heard, information on indicator 3A1 should be embedded in the VNRs as part of the package prepared by the National Statistical Offices, while in the body of the report, there should be place for a few lines to reflect on tobacco control progresses and to ensure this descriptive part in line, the line ministries have a critical role in providing them. As far as the civil society participates in the preparation of the reviews, national NGOs should be encouraged to add their views to reflect on progress in tobacco control. With this in mind, on behalf of the Convention Secretariat, I would like to assure you that we will continue promoting the 2021 guide and help you when requested with advice on how to ensure that reference to progress on Target 3.a and Indicator 3A1 is eventually making its way into the reviews. With that said, I would like to thank all speakers for their presentations, participants for their questions and comments, interpreters that helped us better understand each other, and my colleagues who helped with the organization of this webinar. Thank you all, and goodbye, and good day to all. Goodbye.